The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Channel School, a leading provider of quality educational resources that help teachers bring the world to their students.
On this episode of Assignment Discovery, find out how our most important natural resource could be in jeopardy in water to the last drop. See how contamination threatens this resource and endangers the welfare of millions. Learn about the history of water from Canada to the Middle East. Finally, investigate the latest technologies used to clean and maintain safe water. And find out more about water online at discoveryschool.com. Consider this before viewing Water to the Last Drop, Part 1. Within an ecosystem, all living things depend not only on water, but on each other as well. As you watch the program, pay attention to examples of this interdependence between water, plants, and animals. Note how scientists monitor ecosystems to be sure they are working effectively. What are some signs that an ecosystem is in danger? Assignment Discovery now presents Water to the Last Drop, Part 1.
Water, in all of its forms, covers over 70% of the Earth and cycles endlessly around the planet. We ourselves are made up mostly of water. It's essential for life. But we've taken this most precious substance for granted.
2,000 years ago, the Chinese sage Lao Tzu wrote, "Water is the highest good. The gentlest thing, it overcomes the hardest. Without trying to, it nourishes all things." That same water that Lao Tzu used to quench his thirst in ancient China still continues, evaporating and condensing, cartwheeling around the planet. In China, long ago, or right here and now, water rains down in cyclical rhythms, nourishing all things, and then rises again, going and returning endlessly. Sustenance, highway, and home. A dwelling for some, a larder for others. For all of us, water is life's essence. In ceaseless transformations from solid to liquid to vapor, water ignores the boundaries we draw between these different states, as easily as it ignores the borders we imagine between sea and sky. Considering that our planet is covered 3/4 in water, how odd it seems to call it Earth. 97% of all water on this misnamed planet is salt water in oceans and seas. Of the 3% that is fresh water, almost all of it is trapped in glaciers and polar ice. That leaves only a fraction of a fraction for all of Earth's thirsty creatures. Except for those who have learned to drink directly from the sea.
Most of us know that water covers almost 3/4 of the planet, and every school child learns the water cycle. Water evaporates, forms clouds, rains, evaporates again endlessly. But we often forget that we are also part of the cycle. About 70% of my body is water. That's 58 liters of water that at this very moment are me.
But that water is me for only a brief moment, and then by breath, sweat, and tears, it's lost to the air and must be replaced. The search for new sources of water reflects both our needs and our desires. Even where it's plentiful, our demands for water press hard both on quantity and quality, and we still continue to endanger those living systems that keep our water healthy. We never seem to find water where we want it. Most of the world lives beyond its means when it comes to water use. It's a deficit that we have not yet acknowledged. Moving water across the country does not come cheaply. But move it we do, turning desert into golf courses, gardens, and farms. Drawn by their fertility, we settle in floodplains. Then, without any sense of the absurdity of the situation, we try to stop the flooding, a task that can prove difficult.
Everywhere, everyone fled to higher ground.
What eyes could have looked out at this lush, fertile marsh and seen only wasteland? But many did. Since European settlers arrived, about half the wetlands in the United States have been destroyed. And we continue to destroy wetlands in spite of their importance, not only for these creatures, but for ourselves as well. Wetlands sustain life and purify the water which moves through them. By now we might have learned that trying to tame a river carries a price that has to be paid both by nature and often in our relations with each other. Like on the reservoir in British Columbia, created by this U.S. dam.
Water was up to here last year, okay, and it was nice.
So what happened this year?
This year, well, I guess not enough water.
Well, that's an understatement.
It can't be angry at Americans. I'm not angry at Americans. It's angry at our own government that didn't, fight for us. Like, it seems like the Americans are controlling our water.
The water cycle is not simply an endless repetition of evaporation and condensation. Water, like all living things, is part of a community of rain and mist, marsh and forest. Tall trees, unwilling to wait for rain to fall, reach up and like hands pull water down from the clouds. Powerful roots draw water up from deep underground, and in doing so, make it available to other plants as well. Water flows inside each creature, just as it streams through the forest. Dissolved nutrients are carried to the roots of trees, roots that in turn hold back the rain and runoff, moderating the stream's flow. Behind fallen limbs, quiet pools form, providing a niche for feeding fish. While they live, they shade the river, keeping it cool enough for salmon. Dead, they still stand, still alive with insects and other creatures. Falling, they decompose and feed the river. Bacteria and invertebrates, birds, fish, and mammals, not just steps on some food chain of predator and prey. This is a world of complex interactions where predator becomes prey, and in death, both feed the earth itself. Twisting and falling, dissolving oxygen from the atmosphere. These splashing waters form creeks and streams and rivers. Forest and water keep each other alive. When this intricate harmony is disrupted, it can have serious consequences for all of us. The residents of Canada's West Coast have always thought themselves privileged recipients of the continent's purest water. No longer. In 1991, headlines brought the bad news. British Columbia's water was among the worst in the country. Still, some cities like Vancouver on the Pacific Coast were luckier than others. Dr. John Blatherwick is the Chief Medical Health Officer for the City of Vancouver.
The drinking water in Vancouver is the best, almost in the North American continent, perhaps in the world. Water is the major public health issue. Clean drinking water ranks number one, then what you do with your sewage and your air come after that. But the potential for disease transmission through water is the greatest.
In spite of this, these watersheds, the sources of Vancouver's drinking water, are being logged. It's an old debate. Those responsible for logging the watershed justify it as a necessary step in maintaining the health of the remaining forest. Some feel the motives must be economic. These big trees are worth a lot of money and are very close to market. Those in charge of logging here say any commercial value the logs might have is secondary, a byproduct of forest upkeep. For Dr. Blatherwick, not logging here is simply a matter of prudence.
There is no reason to put a resource as valuable as a watershed at any danger whatsoever. Therefore, the medical officers of the Lower Mainland have been opposed to the continued logging. As such an important resource, we wonder why you keep doing it.
Not all the water we depend on lies visible on the Earth's surface. An important aspect of the water cycle lies hidden underground. Beneath our feet, water permeates rock and gravel, forming aquifers, regions of subterranean water. Dr. John Cherry is concerned with how contaminants get into these underground waters.
And that water that goes down, I guess as it's percolating through then, it's picking up stuff as well.
Well, as it goes from the soil and percolating down to the fractures or cracks, it'll pick up mineral matter, and the water will become harder or softer, and in many cases that improves the quality of water. If the water, however, infiltrates through a contaminated soil, then in those areas it would pick up contaminants and carry those contaminants down to the water table. And over years or decades or much longer, it'll flow along its flow paths to exit areas. The exit areas might be rivers, lakes, streams, or wetlands. This town, Smithville, Ontario, used to get its water supply from wells. But several years ago, the wells were found to be contaminated, and they had to be shut down.
The contaminants in Smithville's water supply came from here, a site that beginning in 1978 had been approved for storage of PCBs. 7 years later, investigations begun by local residents showed that these chemicals were leaking into the ground, and the cleanup began.
It has to be thick.
By 1994, the cleanup here had cost $50 million, and according to Dr. Cherry, it's just starting.
Was the problem at this site. Right. Now there are wells operating at this site, and the wells are operating to actually collect the contaminated groundwater continuously and treat it. So it has to be continually treated and cleaned and then disposed of. But the rate of removal with pumping wells is so slow that unless there's some other way of getting these contaminants out, these pumping wells would have to continue to operate probably for centuries.
The cleanup here is considered a model for Canada's other 3,000 PCB sites. But obviously trying to deal with our mistakes is neither easy nor cheap.
You can easily clean up a stream by stopping the input, but once you get contamination in the groundwater, it seeps through for decades, in some cases centuries. And some of that contamination can end up in streams also. So to protect streams, one has to protect groundwater too.
Water underground moves more slowly than it might in lakes or streams, but it's not separate from them. In the end, all waters flow to the sea. Once a persistent contaminant enters into water anywhere, it's impossible to say where it will end up. The St. Lawrence plays host to many guests, travelers who, like us, use this river as a highway. Our eyes delight at the breathtaking beauty of some who pass through these waters. Hidden from our sight, other mysterious travelers use this waterway. But the beauty of these eels may not be evident to the casual observer. Beautiful or not, they formed part of an important fishery here in Quebec. Eel weirs once dotted the riversides, wooden traps that stood as emblems of a thriving industry. This was a fishery that not long ago netted masses of eels and shipped them throughout the world. But in 1983, the high levels of toxic chemicals present in the eels brought the fishery to a near standstill. Not all the river's creatures are transients. These beluga whales live here year-round, where the Saguenay River meets the St. Lawrence. As many as 10,000 belugas thrived here at the turn of the century. Once we stopped hunting them, the belugas faced no predators here. Even so, their numbers have not bounced back. Perhaps there is more to blame for this than the whale's slow reproductive cycle. Biologist Robert Michaud.
Spending hours and hours looking at beluga in the St. Lawrence, you can't imagine that they are in problem. They look healthy. They have a perpetual smile on their face. What we have learned by studying their carcasses when we found them washed ashore is that they are running into big trouble.
Dead belugas have been washing up on shore at the rate of more than one a month. Scientists strongly suspect the belugas are dying from chemical contamination. They've found almost unprecedented levels of PCBs, DDT, and the insecticide Mirex in the beluga's blubber. Some of the females are so contaminated, their breast milk is like poison.
The toxins in these whales can be traced to many sources, but the presence in the belugas of the chemical Mirex posed something of a riddle. Most Mirex had been produced and stored near the Niagara River, 1,000 kilometers from the beluga's home. But production of the toxin here had stopped almost a quarter of a century earlier. How did Mirex end up in the whales so far away and so many years later? Biologist Pierre Belland was intrigued by this question.
Among the chemicals in the whales, Mirex was just one of them, but we couldn't figure out where it came from. And I inquired, and it turned out that everybody in Lake Ontario had Mirex, fish, gulls, everything. But none of the fish and the birds found around the area here had Mirex, so there has to be a link between the two. And the only link that was possible was the eel, because the eel is a migrating fish. And a colleague of mine had shown that eels were full of Mirex, so that was the only possible source.
Proving that the belugas feed on eels is not simple, but Pierre Belland thinks that the evidence is persuasive.
It turned out that if belugas fed on eels just 1 week per year, it would account for all the Mirex. And at the same time, when a beluga ingests an eel, it gets a bonus, and that bonus is all the other chemicals that the eel brings from Lake Ontario. Well, these eels, during a week, would also account for almost half of all the other toxic compounds in the whales.
By 1988, levels of toxins in the eels had dropped, and the market for them had returned. However, while over 1 million eels were counted in Lake Ontario in 1983, 10 years later, the number was down to around 8,000. It's another fishery that's crashed. The eel's ability to reproduce has somehow been affected, as it seems, as that of the belugas. That may have implications for all of us. When we dump long-lasting and dangerous chemicals into our lakes and rivers, we run the risk that they will affect everyone who lives downstream. If there's something in the toxic brew of chemicals we dump into the Great Lakes that affects reproductive ability, why would we be exempt from these effects? It seems difficult for us to understand that all rivers run to the sea, that water recognizes no borders between nations or species. Once a great salmon river, the Columbia rises in the mountains of western Canada and flows south, till forming a border between the states of Washington and Oregon, it empties into the ocean. The story of the Columbia River holds important lessons about the price that must be paid for taming wild rivers. Our sense of this place is just a snapshot, a fleeting moment in a story that began ages ago. Long before humans engineered the landscape, water scoured and carved these mountains and valleys.
This escarpment reaches a height of 150 meters and extends for about 24 kilometers. During the Ice Age, floods sent water 70 meters deep, crashing over these cliffs to form a falls 5 times wider than Niagara. Except that it's believed those ancient floods were so immense, even this drop was fully submerged beneath the surface of those raging torrents.
Flood crisis in the Pacific
Just as
Northwest.
floods helped shape the Earth's geography, they continue to shape our history.
The worst of all from Vanport, Oregon. Here, floodwaters of the swollen Columbia River broke through a railroad
In the
fill
United States, the drive to harness the Columbia River for irrigation, hydroelectric power, and flood control led to the construction of the Grand Coulee Dam. There are those who would argue that harnessing the Columbia was worth any cost, that it's just the price of progress. But how do you calculate the value of what was lost? Who benefits from the choices that were made? Certainly not the salmon fishermen, nor the salmon. The harnessing of the Columbia River involved Canada and the United States negotiating an agreement, the Columbia River Treaty. This was a project to which Canada contributed more than water. Canadian dams turned the Columbia and Kootenay River systems into reservoirs for U.S. dams downstream. To create these reservoirs, precious valley bottoms were flooded, drowning farm and forest. Is it possible to estimate the value of the forests that were lost, or the potential value of the farms that vanished to make way for reservoirs? A lot was sacrificed to create Lake Koocanusa Reservoir. Along with farms and homes, rich cottonwood forests were removed, and with them, habitat for important herds of large mammals. Trevor Kinley is a biologist who knows this area well.
In addition to the really obvious animals like elk and white-tailed deer that would have used that, and moose, there's a lot of lesser known but very important animals, the mink and beavers, shrew, many different kinds of warblers and other songbirds that would live in that area. And when that was removed farther downstream from us, all that complexity, all those different species were lost and replaced with a very sterile system of gravel, or if you were lucky, some grasses growing.
Step away from the water side, and this region is quite dry. Any water here is important. Trevor Kinley and his partner Nancy Newhouse are studying the riverside habitat in this area of British Columbia.
Is that right? You're fishing?
Yeah. When we get trees and leaf litter that's falling into the creek, provides food for invertebrates, for the small critters that are living in the water, which in turn feeds the fish, and those fish then attract animals like bald eagles and grizzly bears. So we've got something as simple as leaf litter is in one sense actually feeding the grizzly bear. It's a real cycle that's going on there.
Behind this simple statement of life's interconnections is an ecological vision, a point of view that's very different from the economic agenda which dominates government and corporate boardrooms today.
Now that you've seen Water to the Last Drop, Part 1, talk about this. Discuss the ways humans have tried to control the natural forces of water, such as with dams. How does the creation of dams affect the surrounding environment? What do you think are some of the advantages and disadvantages? In what ways has man's interference with nature been unsuccessful or harmful? Now try this. Create a water purifier using materials such as coffee filters, stones, and newspaper. Pour a water mixture of sediment and dirt through your filter to test its effectiveness. Compare water purity of everyone's filters. Log on to discoveryschool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support water to the last drop. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests Fresh Water by E.C. Pialou. Consider this before viewing Water to the Last Drop, Part 2. Think about the many different essential roles that water plays in your life. As you watch the program, pay attention to the role of water in daily life throughout the world. Consider the effects on a community if this water were contaminated or restricted by political conflicts. Assignment Discovery now presents Water to the Last Drop, Part 2.
Here in the desert, you know that water is crucial for life to exist, and why water shortages produce conflicts. As the demand for water increases and clean water gets harder to find, these conflicts heat up. Nowhere is this more obvious than here in the Middle East. These arid lands have long been considered sacred by at least 3 major religions. Conflict over water adds another dangerous element to an already troubled history of tribal, national, and religious violence.
In the desert, water is the limiting factor. It defines what can be done, by whom, and by how many. Water scarcity and increasing population pressures will only add to the serious problems already plaguing the region. Everything here speaks of exile and return, and the tragedy of generations of conflict. This is a region filled with signs of war, as well as symbols of devotion. Along with the political, cultural, and religious disputes are profound ecological problems. Beneath the conflicts about these lands is another conflict about the water on which everyone depends. One of the most important sources of water for Israel lies under the West Bank. It's also one of the most disputed. Everyone agrees that these supplies are being overused and that Israel draws the lion's share. But no one seems to agree on why that is or how these resources should be used. It's not hard to understand that for the sake of peace, as well as to guarantee a future water supply, new answers have to be found.
The barbed wire fence is a reminder that this is one of the most volatile regions in the world. We're a stone's throw from the place the New Testament calls Armageddon, the site of the apocalypse. King Hussein has stated that the only reason Jordan would go to war again with Israel would be over water. So water shortages in this area could have repercussions around the world.
War between Israel and Jordan doesn't seem likely today, but things change course quickly in this part of the world. The Jordan still flows relatively unhindered till it arrives at Lake Kinneret or the Sea of Galilee. From here, water is piped and pumped throughout Israel. It's another point of contention between Israel, Jordan, and Syria, all of whom claim rights to these waters. Water needed to turn dust into gardens. To make the desert bloom was a key element in the Zionist dream. In many ways, it's a dream that's come true. Still, this is a desert, and greening it doesn't come simply or easily.
The kibbutz is a symbol of Israel's determination to make the deserts bloom. But it appears this can only be achieved at enormous cost. Agriculture consumes 70% of the country's fresh water, while 20% of Israel's electricity is used to pump water from the Sea of Galilee alone. Underground aquifers that take centuries to recharge are being drained in decades. Throughout this region and in much of the world, water is the crucial issue.
Even disposing of sewage requires precious water. The sewage in these storage ponds is almost nothing but water. According to Shaul Streit, it's important not to waste that sewage. Towns like Ashdod, home to more than 100,000, need to dispose of their sewage. Farms need it for both irrigation water and fertilizer.
The sewage after the first treatment is being introduced here into the aerated pond. And here is a big population of microorganisms that have their food in abundance, what we call pollution or sewage or problem or waste. For them is a holiday. They have their...
So they're just chewing up the food?
Yes, they do. From here, the effluent is being pumped to the fields. So
it's an idea that's been used on a small scale in other countries. Shaul Streit says that the process of treating the sewage water only really begins in the field.
This is actually a beginning of a treatment process because the root zone around the plant is a real living filter. This is dripped into the soil and it feeds and nourishes the plants, which you see here, the growth of it. That's the end of the story of the sewage.
The desert might be poor in water, but it's rich in sunlight, in solar energy. Add water, and life quickly springs up. The problem is that there's not much water to start with. Imagine if you could cover this pool, trapping the water inside some sort of bubble. Within this tightly sealed enclosure, water would recycle, evaporating, condensing, and raining back down. But you can't just seal an ordinary greenhouse under the baking desert sun. If you could, you might actually change what it means to live in a desert. Amos Richmond is the director of the Jacob Blaustein Institute for Desert Research.
Under these circumstances, the net consumption of water by plants is very much reduced because most of the water plants use evaporates through the leaves.
Yes, but it must get very hot.
It will be hot as anything, and by 9 o'clock people and plants will be cooked there. First the plants, then the people. So therefore, for this bubble to work, you have to have something to cool it. And this has been invented in this institute. This is an optic filter, like the filter you have in your sunglasses, and it filters out a large amount of radiation which would have been converted in that greenhouse into heat. And that particular sunshine or radiation which is expelled, so to speak, is not that which plants need.
The plants react very favorably. As a matter of fact, some plants grow 2 to 3 times, sometimes 4 times faster than in regular heated greenhouses in our kind of environment.
Dr. Reuven Koppel showed me through this extraordinary greenhouse, whose walls and ceilings are filled with a liquid dye that shades out heat but allows in the radiation the plants need. Because it's sealed, it also means there is no need for pesticides or fungicides. But the most astounding benefit is the reduction in the amount of water that's used.
If we compare it to other greenhouses within similar atmospheric conditions, the reduction is about 1 to 10. If we compare it to an open field, the use of water is about 1 to 100.
Wow.
The efficiency of water. This, in effect, takes the water out of the game in the sense that it stops being a limiting factor. Water always is and has been the limiting main or only limiting factor in the desert. In a greenhouse like this, it is knowledge, capital of course, but not water as a limiting factor.
Plants can grow like mad under this circumstance, in the middle of the desert, waste very little water. So the desert, for such a patent or for such an innovation, becomes actually a choice.
While Dr. Richmond and his colleagues think that by using knowledge in place of natural resources, inexpensive technologies like these can change life not only here, but in other desert regions as well. What's being learned here may be important for everyone in a world where there are more of us and less of almost everything else. But solving the region's water problems will take more than new technologies. We need to transform our relationships with each other and with the rest of the living world. A slash of green in a desert of sand. Egypt's fertility has always depended on the generosity of the Nile. But the Nile Delta is subsiding and Egypt is eroding away. The situation here is approaching the limit. Flowing north out of Africa, the Nile passes through 8 other countries before reaching Egypt and the sea. Every year, the population of Egypt increases by almost 1.5 million. And while Egypt contributes no water to the Nile's flow, each of its 57 million human inhabitants and every other creature are almost completely dependent on the Nile's water. A quarter of Egypt lives in Cairo, concentrated in one of the most densely populated cities in the world. Cairo faces the same problems as every modern city, but like its neighbors, Egypt also faces the political and social problems endemic to this part of the world. Demands on the Nile's waters by Egypt and its upstream neighbors go on increasing. At the time of the Camp David Accord, then-President Anwar Sadat of Egypt voiced a sentiment still felt by many of the region's leaders when he said, "The only matter that could take Egypt to war again is water." Not all of the nations in this region are water poor, but none escapes from conflicts about this vital resource. Istanbul straddles the Straits of the Bosphorus, the narrow body of water that divides Asia from Europe. It's not the capital of modern Turkey, but almost since its founding, it's been the capital of mighty empires. It was water that built it here, the attraction of the superb natural harbor called the Golden Horn. There's no obvious water shortage here. There are always fountains, sometimes for their own sake, sometimes for the sake of the body, often to answer the call of religious life. Since 1923, Turkey has defined itself as a modern secular state. But recently, other tendencies have resurfaced. This constant tension between East and West, secular and religious, modern and ancient, continues to shape life in Turkey. But conflicts over water and who controls it become far more serious as you travel east from here. Nourished by the Euphrates River, these ancient lands saw the rise of mighty cities and kingdoms: Mesopotamia, Babylon, Chaldea. Babylon may not have fallen to the sword, but to an excess of water. Over-irrigation destroyed once rich fields as they became waterlogged and poisoned with salt. Now, the 22 dams of Turkey's Eastern Anatolia project are being constructed to harness the Euphrates. In anticipation of rising waters, this entire village is moving up to higher ground. A 1,000 kilometers east of Istanbul, this Kurdish village lives by the same waters that gave birth to the first civilizations that arose here. Intense conflicts between the Kurdish nationalist movements and the Turkish government in this region raise questions about the future of this project, a project that would use the waters of the Euphrates to irrigate an area about twice the size of Holland. Over 200,000 people live in Şanlıurfa. It's said to have been the birthplace of the biblical patriarch Abraham. Some things here feel like they haven't changed since those days. But things are changing. If all goes as planned, the largest irrigation tunnels in the world will carry water to the plain between Şanlıurfa and Haran. Water will come to Haran, and for the first time, the fields around here will no longer be dependent on the vagaries of rainfall. It's said that when Abraham left Ur, he traveled to Haran. This village, with its peculiar conical houses, is perhaps the longest continuously inhabited place on the earth. The residents of Haran may debate the pros and cons of this diversion, not because they doubt that the water will come here, but because they must wonder who in the end will benefit. Who will win or lose is uncertain, but it seems inescapable that the next generation here will grow up in a very different world. Not only Haran, but all of eastern Turkey will feel the impact of these waters. These fields may well quadruple their yield, but what will happen to these sharecroppers is less certain. Will all this water enhance their lives, or will it simply bring large-scale agribusiness, automation, and unemployment?
لا انتم امونا في صالة جاي يصير زين والله والله فصلت الزرخة التاخم خمرة ما تقتلها.
The centerpiece of the Eastern Anatolia project, the Ataturk Dam, was completed in 1990, but that was just the first stage. The summer of 1993 saw the groundbreaking ceremony for the project's latest addition, the Bierjik Dam. Certainly a source of entertainment for the locals. For politicians anywhere in the world, mega projects are an opportunity for speech-making and glad-handing. Large projects like this are usually sold as being good for everyone. They are sources of national pride, but unfortunately, they are also sources of international tension. Tensions between Turkey and her downstream neighbors, Syria and Iraq, have reached the flashpoint more than once over the waters of the Euphrates. But if Syria is outraged with what it sees as interference in its vital supply of water, its downstream neighbors, like Iraq, have voiced the same feelings towards Syria. It's an old story in these arid regions. Ingenuity and technical mastery will help us do more with less. But will conservation or efficiency be enough if we don't learn new ways of relating to each other and a new respect for the natural processes which maintain us all? For some, the next century somehow seems far away. 2/3 of us still have to haul water to our homes. It's a heavy task almost always carried out by women. It's a task that can often take more than 5 hours a day. But clean water is a necessity. Everywhere, our health depends on having enough clean water. And everywhere, that's becoming less possible. But who can imagine what new possibilities we'll discover when we open our eyes to other ways of doing things? All water forms a single endless stream that runs not just through clouds and lakes, but through the breath and blood and cells of every creature on this misnamed planet. As Lao Tzu said so long ago, water is like the highest good. The gentlest thing, it overcomes the hardest. It does not discriminate, but nourishes all things.
Don't go away. Discussion questions, activities, and resources are up next on Assignment Discovery. Now that you've seen Water to the Last Drop, Part 2, talk about this. The greenhouse technology discussed in the program could help arid regions to grow plants with only a fraction of the water needed to irrigate open fields. How could this technological advance change life in the Middle East? discuss why water is such a point of political contention in this part of the world. Now try this. Read a selection of work by the literary naturalist Rachel Carson. Write a reflection on her work, citing examples of how she stressed the interdependence of living things. Log on to DiscoverySchool.com for curriculum materials and resources to support Water to the Last Drop. To learn more, Assignment Discovery suggests The Diversity of Life by Edward O. Wilson.